Hello and welcome to Section 4 of the stalemated 70s of the American pageant for U.S. history, AP U.S. history, or college U.S. history. Today we're looking at the first unelected president through the 70s in black and white. So let's get into it. Gerald Ford, who was appointed vice president after the resignation and the subsequent jailing of Spiro Agnew, Vice President Spiro Agnew, then was appointed president after the resignation of Richard Nixon. So he was elected to a two-year term from Michigan as a member of the House of Representatives, is now the President of the United States. He's the only president we've ever had that was not elected to an executive position. His first address to the nation seemed promising. He said, "Our long national nightmare is over. Watergate took over a year, almost 18 months of investigations and hearings and televised, things going on. It was just kind of like, finally, it's over." He selected the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, the great-grandson or the grandson, I can't remember which one, I think he's great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the richest, wealthiest American in history. However, all credibility for Gerald Ford was shot almost immediately. 1 month into office, he pardoned Nixon 1 month after he resigned of all crimes and misdemeanors, and so Nixon never was put on trial for Watergate. He thought it was time for the nation to move on and heal. The country didn't need to see the former president on trial. And so many people said that this was a corrupt bargain, that he was appointed by Nixon to be president and to be vice president in case that basically if anything went down and Nixon got in trouble, Ford had his back. So it destroyed any confidence the public had in him, and it really kind of it's a false start to his presidency from the very beginning. He was trying to put Watergate behind the country and move on. There was charges of a Nixon-Ford deal. And then it was revealed shortly after this that the United States, that the government was spying on American citizens. In December 1974, the public learned that CIA and the FBI kept secret files on people, and very prominent people like Martin Luther King Jr. And so in a long series of, you have Vietnam, you have, the My Lai massacre, you have Watergate, you have the illegal bombings of Cambodia, the illegal invasion of Cambodia, Watergate, like I said, you have the spying on Americans. And so at this point, Americans' faith in government is pretty small. Ford was also known for falling down a couple times, which is ironic. He's probably the best athlete that was ever president. He was a football lineman at the University of Michigan. He was a star football player, but he fell down the stairs a couple times, and there's videos of it and all that. And here you can watch a little bit of it.
Raindrops kept falling on their heads as Gerald and Betty Ford arrived in Austria.
Poor guy. And then The Simpsons lampooned him a little bit. There's a famous episode where Homer and George Bush are neighbors, and this is Bush seniors, and they hate each other, and they become this rivalry. And then Bush leaves because Bart Simpson ruined his memoir. And so then Gerald Ford moves in and says, "Hi, I'm President Ford." And he says, "Homer, do you like nachos? Do you like football? Do you like beer? Do you want to come over and watch some football?" And here, you can watch it in Spanish.
Hola. Mucho gusto. Acabo de mudarme. Me llamo Jerry Ford. ¿El expresidente Gerald Ford? Venga esa mano, soy Homero Simpson. Oye, Homero, ¿te gusta el fútbol? Que sí me gusta. ¿Te gustan los nachos? Sí, señor Ford. Bueno, te invito a mi casa a ver el juego y a comer nachos y tomar cerveza. Jerry, creo que tú y yo nos vamos a llevar muy... Oh!
So the point, if you look at it, we'll pause it, never mind. The point is, 20, 30 years later, people still remembered him falling down. This is an SNL thing about Gerald Ford dying years before he did.
Gerald Ford.
Well, Ford's in good shape. He plays golf.
Just covering our bases, Tom. You never know.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Gerald Ford dead today.
I put that because I can't think of Gerald Ford without thinking of Gerald Ford. Check it out if you get a chance on the SNL app. So he then grants amnesty to draft dodgers, which further inflames conservatives and outrages people in this country. He's trying to heal the nation of all the wounds that have come previously In foreign affairs, he relied on Kissinger. You did a good job for Nixon. Do your thing. Let's do this. Let's continue détente. Let's continue this Cold War thaw. He did meet with Leonid Brezhnev to limit nukes in 1974. He was actually the one who signed the SALT agreement, not Nixon, because they didn't have the chance to. He also signed the Helsinki Accords, which in July 1975, somebody pointed out in 1975 that there was never any peace treaty to end World War II. Technically, all these nations were still at war. Until they met to agree upon the borders at the end of World War II and officially close the war. They pledged to respect human rights and liberties. Yeah, that didn't work. And then also he worked for a close relationship with the Chinese after Mao Zedong, the great Red Emperor, died in 1976. With the Vietnam War, the United States had pulled out, but the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam. The final invasion was in 1975. Ford asked Congress for aid to help South Vietnam, but it was denied. The last Americans from the embassy escaped here via helicopter. It was a total disorganized mess. People were trying to get out. The Vietnamese actually stole helicopters and landed on American choppers. And it just was an ugly scene. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell to communist forces. Their 30-year civil war was over. Their period of war that lasted even more, 35 years, was finally over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The North Vietnamese won, and Vietnam becomes a communist country. This is a picture of a gentleman in the helicopter punching a Vietnamese guy trying to get on board. In all, Vietnam, 2 million Vietnamese were killed. 58,000 Americans died, 300,000 wounded, 2.7 million Americans served. And this tragic thing, there's always the tragedy of the death and the wounded and the crippled from the war. But the tragic thing was the treatment of the veterans when they came home. It did cost $150 billion in cost. 1.5 million fled Vietnam, and there's a huge influx of Vietnamese to the United States, especially into California. Cambodian Civil War did erupt nearby. But like I was saying, the most tragic thing was there's no hero's welcome for the veterans. The men who came home served, and many of them against their own will. They were drafted, who saw their friends die or be permanently wounded, who were suffering with PTSD themselves, were treated poorly. They were spat upon. They were called baby killers. They were shunned. And it's really a sad, tragic mark in American history. And hopefully one of the lasting legacies of the Vietnam War is I think our nation has grown up to the point where maybe we don't agree with something. We don't agree with a war like the invasion of Iraq in 2003. A lot of people opposed that invasion. But our public generally supports the troops because they are making sacrifices. Because of instances like the My Lai massacre and the negativity in the press. And so there was a lot of anti-soldier, anti-army during this time. 15% they estimate suffered PTSD. America loses its luster of, quote, being undefeated in war. But if you look at the record of U.S. wars, they tied a lot. There wasn't a huge victory in some of them. In a step towards healing, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in 1982 with the names of every member who was killed in Vietnam, the American Armed Forces, on that. Pretty astounding thing to see. This is a picture of it in D.C. It peaks in the middle to show the climactic action of the rising of the war and the following the war. And so people do engravings. It's a very powerful thing to see. It's right by the Lincoln Memorial. Highly recommend if you're in D.C., go see it. This is for the POWs. This faces the wall. These are the men who came home and survived, and they carry that pain and that guilt with them, and that's what that statue is for. Shifting gears in terms of feminism, in 1972, Congress passed Title IX for the Education Amendments, which prohibited sex discrimination and every federal assisted education program, which meant schools across the nation had to have equal opportunities for boys and girls, and that included sports. And this is when you get the explosion of women's sports onto the forefront of high school, college, and eventually, it's not bound by it, but eventually you have pro-women's sports as well. Congress approves the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, to amend the Constitution to prohibit laws that discriminated based on sex. They didn't get enough states to ratify it. And so some states, there was a statute of limitations. They gave it 10 years. It expired. Some states actually rescinded their approval. And then just recently, a couple months ago, the 38th state approved it. And so now it's in limbo. It might be added to the Constitution, but it had the sunset of 10 years, so they're not sure. But it has the prerequisite 38 of 50 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, we'll see what happens here in the future. Then in a very, very, very controversial Supreme Court case in Roe v. Wade, 1973, the Supreme Court invalidated laws which banned abortion, allowing abortion to be legalized in the country. This is the abortion wars, a picture of that. It's still a hot topic to this day. And so then the 70s in black and white. In Milliken versus Bradley in 74, it ruled that desegregation plans could not require students to move across district lines. At one point, they were busing kids. The schools weren't being integrated because there's two types of segregation. There's just segregation. Like I was saying, there's two types of segregation. There's segregation de jure by law, which was banned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then there's segregation de facto, which was the matter of fact that there's white and black neighborhoods. And so what they found in the early 70s and late 60s, early 70s, that there was white schools and black schools. So they were busing white kids across town to black schools and black kids across town to white schools. My dad had to do this in Denver. He had a neighborhood school, just blocks away, and he was bused downtown with African Americans. This is a picture of a little white boy getting off, or a couple white kids getting off the bus with African Americans. And so they tried to mix purposely the schools. Very controversial. People in Denver actually broke into the bus barn and set fire to buses. No kids were on them, to protest busing. And so this basically struck down that they couldn't make them do that. This reinforced the idea of the white flight and struck down busing policies. Then controversially, in University of California versus Back in 1978, Back had applied for admission to Cal Berkeley's med school. He was denied, and he found out that that because he was white, he was denied because they had a quota under affirmative action that allowed that they had to look for a certain number of blacks or African Americans and minorities to be admitted. And so basically, he took this all the way to the Supreme Court. The university ruled that it could not favor applicants based on the quality of the race in individual cases. So you couldn't deny admittance because this person was white, or this person was black, or this person was Latino or Asian. But they could have an overall policy for the whole university to cut guidelines like, hey, we should admit, a good chunk or give more opportunities towards African Americans. It was a 5-4 vote. Very controversial. In dissent, in a very passionate opinion, Thurgood Marshall, the only African American judge on the Supreme Court, warned that this denial of racial preferences might erase all the progress of civil rights. For conservatives, it was basically a triumph that justice was colorblind. It's still controversial to this day. And then finally, you have the United States versus Wheeler in 78, which the Supreme Court ruled that Native American tribes had limited sovereignty, that they could make their own laws. And this was after a lot of protests in the 60s and 70s by Native Americans. Protesters actually seized Alcatraz in 1970. They had seized Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 72 to try to, raise awareness to their plight, to poverty, and to their, subjugation to the United States government. And they wanted autonomy. They wanted the right to do their own thing, which they largely get in the United States versus Wheeler, which is why Native American reservations to this day can have they can have casinos and other laws. They're different than the rest of the states that they are. That's all I have for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions.